Welcome to the Draft Deeper podcast. This is your host, Nathan Grubel. Joining me as always is my producer, Kevin Black, and my co-host, Stephen Gillaspie, back with me to go over the next section of his big board. That's right. We're releasing this podcast on a Tuesday. That means from now, again, all the way through till the end of the draft, we're going to have big board podcasts queued up every Tuesday. And we went through the first section of Steven's board last week that we wanted to go through, 60 through 45, although I think we're going to be slightly touching on the 45th ranking in a few seconds.
Maybe.
Steven will take over that one, but really we wanted to focus on 44 through 30. So again, counting down from 60 all the way to 1, this is kind of like your mid-second round rankings all the way through to the early second round of Steven's board. So this draft's going to have a ton of variance. When I was talking with Chuck, anybody who listens to the podcast that we just released with Chucking Darts, I kind of made the proclamation that I think there's going to be some misses in kind of like the late lottery all the way through to like the back end of the first round. But I think there's going to be some smart NBA teams that recoup a lot of value in like the 25 through 45 range. So even though we might not be talking first round guys, and some people out there might be like, oh, why am I listening to this podcast? I want to hear about the first round. I want to hear about the top names. Well, I can almost assure you that between this section on Steven's board and then when we get into the early part of next week's episode, and then once we go through a similar section on my board, I can almost guarantee you there are going to be legitimate NBA contributors that come out of these sections of our boards respectively. So I consider this an important episode. Steven, how you doing tonight, man? You ready to do this?
Yeah, man, I'm ready to get it going. I'm doing well. You know, we were talking about how players are just continually entering the draft. And if for people watching, I literally pulled all my hair out because players will not stop entering the draft and making me watch film on them. So I've had to make adjustments to my board. Nathan, you spoke on just a second ago that we're going to start at 45 because we talked about Leonard Miller last week, and you said you were so proud of me that I didn't initially just vault him up to my top 30. Still haven't done that, but he is up a little bit since I've got to watch more film, listen to more analysis and things like that on him. So today we're going to be starting with prospect number 45 because we didn't talk about him yet. We were going to anyway, but now he's at a lower position, that being Justin Lewis out of Marquette, the forward out of Marquette. So we're starting off with the bang here because I know that Justin Lewis has some fans at No Ceiling. And Nathan, we talk about this all the time. I mentioned it on the last episode that the margin of talent between prospects like 20 through 45 isn't very significant at all. So just because I have Justin Lewis all the way down here at 45, I do see a pathway for him to be a good NBA player. It's just how difficult is that pathway? How valuable is the role that he's going to play in the NBA compared to the absolute highest of highs from some of these other prospects? Justin Lewis has a great build. Like, he's very strong. He's very talented. He's a better three-point shooter than I think memory will serve people. Like, you can go and look at the numbers and be like, okay, like he's an okay three-point shooter. Then you go and actually watch more film. And you're like, okay, like he actually has a stroke. And then you consider him defensively, and you would like to think, okay, he can guard 3s and 4s, maybe some 5s, depending on the matchup. Maybe he can play some 5 himself because of how strong he is. But ultimately, not really having much equity with the ball in his hand as a forward, I think is going to hurt him a little bit. How consistent is that shot going to be? How diverse is his shot diet? And again, like, what else can he bring to the team other than just being like a roll man / stationary three-point shooter? That's why I have him here at 45, Nathan.
No, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think I'm probably going to end up with him a little higher than you on my board, but not a ton higher. I don't have a first round grade on him either. And the reason behind that is he is going to be more of a developmental prospect I think people give him credit for. He's really caught in a little bit of an awkward place positionally. Like, he's the 6'7", 235, 240 pound forward. Like, he has that thick build, almost reminds me of some of the things that people said about Wendell Carter when Wendell Carter was coming out of college. And a similar type of build, obviously not 100% the same. I mean, Wendell Carter is a center, but just in terms of that thickness to them, that slows them down a little bit.
Yep.
I don't fully buy into Justin's feet being a huge factor for him on either end of the floor. I think it's going to limit his mobility in guarding different positions on the defensive end. And then offensively, I just don't see how he moves like some of these guys who you might be able to masquerade out in like that 4-3 type of role and play some wing. I think Justin Lewis is more of like a big when we use the word forward leading towards big. So there are some nice skills to work with. There is a little bit of defensive versatility. He can definitely help protect the rim a little bit from the weak side defensively, and then offensively, very nice pick and pop type option. Pick and roll, pick and pop type option. He does, in my opinion, set good enough screens where that's going to come into play for him at the NBA level. I think if you're drafting him, you want him to develop a little more on the ball sauce. That to me is that's years down the road. I don't think his handle is there quite yet, nor do I think some of the movement again ultimately fits with that type of role. I think if that's how you want him to play, you got to work with him on his body a little bit, have to improve that ball handling, and then maybe we start seeing a little more of that shot creation. He can hit like a one dribble pull-up, but that, in my opinion, is about the extent of what he can do right now. But again, if you develop him more on the big avenue, I think there's definitely some value to be had on both sides of the ball. So that's why I have him as a second round grade, much more of like a developmental prospect, in my opinion, than somebody who's ready to, come out and produce right away in the NBA.
Yeah, and it sounds like you and I see him similarly, and that's something that we spoke about on the last podcast. It's more so, let's get the evaluations right, and then, if we want to get picked on for having a guy 8 spots lower than maybe we should have, then okay, I might take that lump on the head. But as long as we're seeing this prospect the same way, that makes me feel better about myself, because at least we'll both be wrong if he hits, right? So there we go for that. All right, so now we're going to start the show with where we should have started it if it wasn't for Leonard Miller film study, that being prospect number 44. And I'm just going to throw out this, precursor here. The next 2 prospects could completely outdo where I put them, but I'm starting to reward more production instead of potential. And I think that I even spoke on this on my latest, article for the Weekend Warrior about ageism and it being gross. Like sometimes we can fall in love with guys being younger than being freshmen because of their timeline and the potential that if you take them younger, they can mature at a higher level, therefore be better sooner, maybe. I don't know. But at some point, we got to start rewarding production. And that's why I have Caleb Houston out of Michigan here at 44. Now, early on in the season, due to where a lot of, preseason projections had him, I even saw him as high as like number 5 for some places, like reputable draft, outlets had him that high.
But he was a lottery pick for the majority of people before the year.
Yeah, absolutely. So now watching him, he didn't really live up to that at all. And, I'm going back and I'm watching prospects who can come in and play the role that he is projected to. I don't even know if he's really going to stay in. Like he might test and come back. There's already rumors of that circulating. So 3-point shooter that really didn't hit that well, didn't really defend that well, wasn't impressed with him with the ball in his hand, rebounded decently for his position, but didn't blow me away there. Michigan is one of these schools where everyone just kind of plays a role a little bit. So maybe that has to do with, the output that we got from him. But I didn't really walk away from this season all that impressed with him. Maybe his, preseason stuff can come back to bite me in the butt, but I have him at 44, Nathan.
So really, I mean, we can kind of lump in the 2 guys together because you have Max Christie at 43, not to steal too much of your thunder, but
no, please.
Caleb, I'll let you say some kind words about Christie because I would have more kind words to say about him. I think if we're going to bet on either of the 2 living up to their potential, I would definitely take Christie at this point over Houston. And the reason behind that is I just think Christie's going to have more on-ball stuff potentially at the NBA level. Like I don't hate him when he turns the corner off pick and rolls. I think he's got a nice floater game that he can go to. And then off ball, I trust him being deployed in ways where you can get him off movement, not just to catch and shoot the ball, but also on cuts, getting him downhill to the basket. And again, either being able to finish with that runner or finish through contact at the basket. I think he's going to get there 6'6", much better body in my opinion, even though Houston's a little bit bigger at 6'8". He lacks some of the ability to be able to contort in the air and finish at different angles and also finish through guys. I don't see the contact and the strength portion being as much of a problem for Christie. But yeah, that's really where it comes back to with me for Caleb Houston is this guy did not show me the ability to be able to turn the corner well off of pick and roll when he had the ball in his hands. He's a little bit slow getting downhill. And then when he gets to the basket, you can meet him with size or guys of similar stature. If they're stronger than him, they can push him and knock him off of that shot. And he just can't get to some of the same angles that we would expect him to be able to get to if that was a role that he was going to be much more comfortable at the NBA level, having the ball in his hands more. So if we're really diagnosing him as like a movement shooter and the shot's not falling and he's not holding his own defensively at any sort of position one way or the other, and some of the off-ball defensive stuff becomes really inconsistent as well, like it does for a lot of young guys, what are we really projecting him to be able to do in the NBA if the shot's not falling? So I agree with you. He could certainly outperform more of his draft position, but I would much rather take a swing on somebody like Christie, who I just think is going to be able to do more at the NBA level, even if his shot isn't exactly falling all year round, because we saw Christie defend much better than
absolutely
at Michigan State too. So
yeah, and I was going to touch on that too. I like Christie's point of attack defensive potential at the NBA level. And you talk about him being smaller but a better athlete. He's more explosive. He has a quicker twitch than Caleb Houston. And that was something that kind of disappointed me, was everyone can kind of fall in love with, and this is me included, Nathan, I'll let you speak for yourself. I can kind of have a tendency to see, okay, he's tall and he can shoot. Like that's what everyone in the NBA wants, but you also have to parlay that with good athleticism. And I don't think that Houston has that yet. I don't even know if he's in the best shape that we need to see him at. You know, at Michigan, he just looked like he was almost going through the motions. He didn't look like he was a guy that had been putting in like tremendous amount of work on his body, like maybe studying the playbook, maybe finding spots on the court that he's comfortable. But I would like to see him maybe in a little bit better condition. You know, maybe that helps him and separates and helps that kind of midair like change of the shot that you were speaking of with him.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call him like a bad athlete, but I just
not a poor athlete, but I'm saying like I think that we can envision him being more athletic with a little bit better conditioning, if that makes sense.
It does. I just don't think he's ever going to have that burst off of his initial first step, that he would really need to be able to turn the corner in situations where he'd have the ball in his hands a little more. Like I just, after watching enough of him, I just don't think that's ever going to be there for him. So again, it's maybe getting himself in better condition, Stephen, to your point, getting his stamina up more and just getting a little quicker in terms of, you know, darting around the court, right? Running off movement, being able to get himself open and then catch, turn, and shoot. Like, yeah, that can absolutely happen.
Yeah.
But just in terms of like the burst, I don't see that ever improving for him.
Yeah. And I think too, what kind of hurt my perception of Houston all season long was, what is he doing, or what are we projecting him to possibly able to do that we're not already seeing a guy like Tyler Burton, who I don't have on my list. And he's one of these guys that I kind of want to put in my top 60, but I just can't bring myself to doing it. But we have Caleb. It's, you know, the joke that Maxwell always makes, you know, is like, why do we need Caleb Houston when we have Tyler Burton at home? You know what I mean? Like Tyler Burton kind of already does everything that we want Caleb Houston to do. He's just younger, and we can kind of fall in love with the age, which I spoke to earlier.
We can. And I think the last point I'll say on Christie before we move into some of the other guys here is that I wouldn't be shocked if somebody still took like a top 20 swing on Max Christie. Like I have Christie higher than you do. I
Sure.
Honestly can't remember where I have Houston on my latest board, but I know I have Christie a little higher. It would not shock me if somebody still bought in on a top 20 grade on him. It would shock me if somebody was still that high on Caleb Houston. They're taking him in like the top 20, top 25 range.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily in love with where I have Christie. But again, you know, like we'll get into some of these other names, and I feel more confident in what they project to do. So just to recap, we had Justin Lewis at 45, Houston at 44, Max Christie at 43, which rolls us right into Keon Ellis, a prospect that I had written about during the Weekend Warrior, keying in on Keon Ellis. He's got an NBA level or ready game. You know, he's one of these 3-and-D prospects, meaning that he can shoot the three, he can do a little bit extra when chased off the line, and obviously he can defend. So Looking at Alabama, we were talking last week how disappointed we were with what we saw from J.D. Davison. Keon Ellis is an NBA caliber prospect. It's just how high is his high? I feel like he's going to be a very safe prospect. Maybe that warrants moving him up a little bit higher. But, if you look at the three-point shooting, he can do it from pretty much anywhere on the court. You look at his defense at the SEC, he was asked to take on some really tough assignments, and he did it and did everything that he could. When you consider the backcourt that Alabama had, you had J.D. Davison and Shackelford, and then obviously, you had Keon Ellis contributing there too. So looking at everything that Alabama was dealing with, Keon Ellis performing at the level that he did defensively, I think speaks volumes to him. And then obviously his three-point potential, if you look on Synergy, they're all beautiful numbers there. They're all flattering, speaking to how deadly of a outside shot that he has. So I have him at 42, Nathan.
This is probably the only prospect that I think you and I just have like a major disagreement on. And
okay.
it's not that I think you're finding anything wrong in your evaluation. This is honestly one of those guys I just don't see it with.
Okay.
I know he's 6'6", he has length. I'm not in love with the rest of his body composition. He can defend multiple positions at a really good level. He's competitive. He gets after it. Just offensively, there's still something about the shooting that I don't trust. And when we project an NBA, a guy coming to the NBA to be like a 3-and-D, like you really have to shoot the three at a high level, man. Like you really need to bring that to the table. And there's just something about the shooting that I don't trust. Like he did to his credit. First of all, he's an older guy coming in. I think there's a chance he might be 24.
I think he is. I haven't looked at his numbers.
I went through and you and I were adjusting some of the ages in our database. I think he's going to be 24. At the very least, he'd be 23 on draft night. So he is an older guy coming in already. But I would have expected more from him offensively at this point in his career. And the fact that I still have questions about his shooting and some of the other things he brings to the table offensively. I know the defense is awesome. I don't know if it's going to be like, I don't know, Herb Jones type awesome in the NBA or
another
like
older
Jose
prospect
Alvarado type awesome. Like the Pelicans really did themselves some favors hitting on those two guys and buying in on the defense and just hoping that they can do enough offensively to justify having them on the court for their defensive value. I guess there's a way that Keon Ellis could get there defensively to be that important to an NBA team, but I just don't know if I'm buying the offense at that level. And maybe there just truly is something that I'm missing. He just never really jumped out on the page for me, off the TV screen for me offensively as much as he did defensively. So maybe it's just I'm only buying one half of the prospect. Maybe I'm just getting the evaluation wrong, and that's okay. There's usually like one or two guys every draft class that for whatever reason, I just can't see it and I can't buy in. A lot of the time I kind of end up being right about those guys. Like if I didn't understand it, like there's usually a reason why they don't work out, but I'm leaving it open for me to be wrong about this guy, Steven, because again, the defense has looked that good, not just by the numbers, but also on tape. And there are a lot of other numbers that check out for him. Like the fact that I say I don't trust the shot, yet it stayed virtually around the same percentage, 36.6% on much more significant volume compared to his first year at Alabama. Like there is something to be said about some of the improvements that he made. It's just, I don't know. I'm personally just not able to bring it all together.
I think that the Alabama team just overall leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. And again, considering that everything he did, if you look at the size of some of the guys that he played with, Shackelford, Quinterly, Davison, like those are
he had to cover a lot of ground defensively.
He had to cover a lot of ground defensively, and then the errors in decision making that he had to do with when J.D. Davison was on the court. The fact that Shackelford never saw a shot that he didn't like. I loved Quinterly. Like I had Quinterly within.
He also hasn't seen a shot that he doesn't like either, but
also hasn't seen another shot that he hasn't liked. So if you consider all of that, and Gray on that team too, he's a chucker. So there's really not a lot of, ball movement on this team, but in my deep film study for him, there was a lot of off ball stuff that I loved, shot relocation, even the ability to put the ball on his ground, make whip passes. I'm not saying that's going to be the majority of what he does in the NBA, but he has a little bit of dynamic playmaking in his game that can help offset whatever pressure, a defense might put on him on the line. So
I was wrong. I apologize. I was thinking of somebody else. He's going to be 22 on draft night. So that's my fault. I posted not as damning as like 24, but he's still an older guy because he transferred in Alabama from a smaller school. So
absolutely. And just another thing I'll say real quick before we move on, on NoCeilingsNBA.com, where you can read my latest Weekend Warrior piece, I wrote about ageism and how it's gross. And Nathan, you and I both, we don't believe in practicing ageism in the draft. If you go back and look at teams that took chances, and yes, they were chances on some older guys, in late first, early second round draft picks, teams that weren't even necessarily good at the time, but they made these picks, turning it around. What makes good teams good and bad teams bad? It simply comes down to making some of these safer plays. You spoke to this when we were on the OKC podcast, where you were talking about, let's take some singles, let's take some doubles, let's fortify our roster a little bit. Herb Jones, Jalen Brunson, like guys that are balling out in the playoffs right now weren't necessarily projected to be able to do that type of stuff, right? So you're looking at a guy like Keon Ellis, and we'll talk about some of these other players later. Like, sure, like the teenage guys, they can be, they can get your blood flowing a little bit. You can see more of a long-term future. But I think that when we look at college prospects and we say, like, this guy's 23, we think that he's old for the earth. But then you watch Herb Jones ball out in the playoffs and you're like, this kid's got a lot of potential. Like, he can still grow and get better. Like, it's almost like they jump through a portal and go into another dimension. And then they go from being old to young. And we're just like, why can't we look at them like that when they're in college,
And that's why I wouldn't fault anybody for taking Keon Ellis with the second round pick. Like, the type of archetype that he falls into, not to knock one off the draft Twitter bingo card already, but the 6'6" plus size wingspan, if the 3-point shot does come around, and then the defense to be able to cover so much ground on the perimeter, potentially at the NBA level. Like, yeah, that's the type of guy you want to take a swing with a second round pick. He doesn't have the same upside as some of the other names that we'll talk about in later portions of these podcast episodes, but that is the type of guy, like, if you believe in him, maybe just because he's not in that range on my board, if same time, if you believe in him and that's where you want to take him, I got zero problems with it.
Right on. So we'll roll in right into number 41. Trevor Keel is a guy who I had early on in the season, kind of like middle to late first, and as the season kind of progressed,
he was top 10 on ESPN at one point, man. Top 10.
If the draft was after his first game, he might have been a top 5 pick. Like he had a big performance early on in the season, and that was kind of damning for him. Kind of like Kendall Brown, a guy that we might talk about later, he had a 10 assist game, and everyone's just like, oh, look out, like this guy is going to be able to do a whole bunch of everything. I don't know if he had a 3 assist game after that 10 assist game, So same thing with Trevor Keel, is like he had significant moments, but there's still a lot that he's got to work out. He was largely touted as a 3-point, just sniper coming into the season, and he's a capable 3-point shooter. I'm not saying write him off that he's not going to be able to shoot, but there wasn't a lot of evidence in college to support what we saw in a high school. And kind of the same thing with Caleb Houston. I don't know if I trust his decision making as a lead guard, but holy crap, this guy can defend his tail off.
Yep.
And watching him as an on-ball defender, there's some things to like as a team defender. You like the fact that he might even be able to defend the 3 on his best days. So, rebounding is also another thing. Pushing the break is something that you can talk yourself into with Keels, but you got to wonder, is this guy as a guard going to be able to help run pick and rolls? Do you trust him to be a spot up shooter? Anything else in his game that you feel confident with, other than him being able to hold his own on a second unit against another guard to spell whoever he is relieving for a couple minutes? That's why I have him here at 41, Nathan.
He's a linebacker in a guard's body, very similar to Luke Dort. That was, I think, an easy comp for everybody to be able to make if he's at his best on his best days, but he just couldn't put it together consistently over the course of the whole year. And there was some injury stuff in there that definitely limited his development throughout the course of the year. Obviously, the shooting was inconsistent all year, only rated out in the 32nd percentile on spot ups. If we were getting the Trevor Keels out of high school, who was a much better shooter than what he showed at Duke, this would probably be a different story. But because of some of those inconsistencies, because he's not one of these like isolation type of bucket getters. If the jump shot's not falling, if he's not able to go to like a runner shot, if he's not finishing as well around the basket as we would expect him to be able to finish as well with that body type, only in the 41st percentile around the basket, what did he really show us that he can do on a consistent basis offensively, other than maybe he's a better shooter than the numbers would give him credit for during his freshman year? And maybe there's a little more passing creativity to be able to tap into, whether maybe he's not a primary ball handler at the NBA level. Maybe somebody you can run off of actions, get him going as like a secondary type of ball handler. Maybe there's some more stuff to unlock there. But I think the evaluation that we have on him after his freshman year, it's much more projection and potential than we have firm evidence, which is going to be really a key factor with a lot of these guys that we're talking about on this episode of the podcast, and maybe into next week's edition of the Big Board podcast. It's a theme that a lot of us scouts are struggling with, the between us to some guys who are getting paid to do this as their full-time job, to guys working in NBA offices. Like these are the types of questions we have, and it's why I can picture a number of these guys ultimately deciding to come back to school. And it would not shock me if Keels ended up coming back for his sophomore year, because that team's looking loaded already. Like he would be surrounded with a very similar bar of talent that he had this year. And if he can just put more consistency together, surrounded by that better talent where he can make plays for others and they're going to be able to finish those plays. It's not like he's playing with guys who won't be able to take and make shots. Like, maybe we're coming back and getting Keels in that like late lottery type of conversation next year, compared to where he's at now in a lot of people's boards, which is like, late first round, early second round, the mid second round.
Yeah. And I got a question for you, Nathan. And we can even project out, if he does come back next season, it's going to be much of the same, because they're in talks to get AJ Green out of Northern Iowa. They already have a strong recruiting class. That Duke's going to be loaded, right? So I have a question for you, particularly about Keels. We see on Duke that, he had to compete with ball handling duties with guys like, Wendell Moore Jr., Paolo Banchero, and even Jeremy Roach, right? So there's 4 ball handlers on that team predominantly. AJ Griffin didn't even get a lot of opportunities to create with the ball in his hands, which may affect his ultimate, where he ends up, projection wise. If he was doing this on Kentucky, where they always get that benefit of the doubt with their guards, that they share ball handling duties, and maybe there's more to his bag than he was able to lay out, do you think that if it was just in Kentucky vice Duke, would that help his draft stock?
No, I think he'd be in the same place. The one thing I'll say, and we had this conversation last week, Stephen, and it's a similar theme that we can probably run through all the way through these Big Board podcasts, is that if you come back to school, you should be coming back to school because you have more to show in your bag, Absolutely. Not necessarily just being better off of what you showed us you may be able to do this past year. Like Trevor Keels, to his credit, did show a lot of creativity, both scoring and passing, when he had the ball in his hands out of pick and roll sets. It was really more of these other types of actions, or him being more of an off-ball player where he really struggled, where if he can come back and he can prove that, no, I'm a primary guy, I can be a point guard, I deserve to have the ball in my hands to be making decisions for everybody else, and improve and really prove that he can do that in more of a volume role, that's worthwhile to come back for. And having that type of skill set and proving you can do it at volume and being worth NBA level touches in that type of role, that would absolutely skyrocket his draft stock.
And it would be interesting to see how the new regime at Duke uses him, because, we know that Coach K is gone, and there's a lot of people who just believe that Coach K is more of a recruiter now than he was actually X's and O's. And, we saw them run the same play set into the ground all tournament long. So,
but I mean, like coming back, like Jeremy Roach is going to be the point guard next year. Like, you're telling me that Trevor Keels at his best maybe couldn't beat out Jeremy Roach for a lot of those ball handling duties. Like,
I don't know, man. AJ Green, if he transfers there, like that's going to be a nasty backcourt if they were able to land him and Keels come back like that. Mm-hmm. Oof. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you could be excited about for Duke's future here, especially with Keels, if Keels comes back, excuse me. But we'll move on now to number 40, a guy who is in kind of that hodgepodge of big men. We mentioned guys like Ishmael Kamagate several times here on Draft Deeper. We talked about Walker Kessler last week. We're going to be hearing about more of these guys as this list continues to grow. But today, and at spot number 40, I have Christian Koloko, admittedly a guy who I think could outplay where I have him. I just drop bigs. I said it last week. They're limited in where they can go and play. And with that being the case, like some of these teams already have drop bigs. So it's like how much exposure and minutes and run is this guy going to get? I do like him defensively, but offensively, he's probably one of these guys that could be super efficient, but how much room to grow is there? You know, do you trust him being able to go out on the perimeter? I really don't. I like him on the perimeter a little bit better than Kessler, which is why I have him ranked higher. But a guy who on his best days is going to be a great rim deterrent, a great rotational big, a guy who I think locker rooms are going to love. You know, by all accounts, everything that I saw and heard coming out of Arizona, he's a great teammate. You know, players were sad to see him go, but also excited because that they know he offers a lot for an NBA team. I think that he's an NBA guy. I just don't know what level of output and production he's going to put. So that's why I have him here making the top 40, which is a big accomplishment for a lot of these guys, Nathan.
I have him in a very similar place on my updated board. And the reason behind that, I mean, we talked about it a little bit last week with Walker Kessler. There's bigs who are much better in drop coverage and having guys come to them. There's big men that can go out and go to their particular matchup. And then there's these rare guys that can kind of do a little bit of both, right? And Koloko is a more efficient offensive player than Kessler. That's not debatable. Just go look at the numbers if you wouldn't believe me. But
and watch the tournament too. I mean, he helped Arizona out a lot in the early going.
But he's not a post-up guy, right? So that's not how you're going to be using him. And he doesn't have the same vertical leaping ability, in my opinion, that somebody like a Mark Williams has. Like he's not the plus athlete that Mark Williams is. So he's a little more limited in terms of how he's ultimately going to get you buckets at the NBA level. But defensively, when he is at his best in drop coverage, he can look really, really good. He's not the best rebounder of the bigs in this draft class, but he's serviceable. And then, if teams are able to find creative ways to get him the ball near the basket and let him finish, then he can be a productive NBA player for you. Probably like a big man is going to be coming off the bench a lot of his career. I don't see the same starter upside with him as some of the other big men that we could talk about, more notably Mark Williams. So that's why I have Koloko in like that early to mid second round range as well.
Yeah, and I trust his second jump better than Kessler. I trust his even though Kessler had a historic shot blocking season for Arizona, I don't know how much of that was all personal ability instead of scheme or funneling or help having a guy like Jabari Smith Jr. defensively on that very same front court. So Koloko, I think that he gets kind of a bad rub that he is not an athlete. I couldn't disagree with that more. I actually like him more athletically than Kessler. It's just that it's a different feel. And I think that he kind of falls victim to that, you know, West Coast time zone where not a lot of people are staying up to watch Arizona as they are for Auburn. And shout out to Auburn for Johnny Broome, transferring over there. That's going to be a fun team to watch for next year for another Auburn big man that might be making his way to the NBA here soon. So Nathan, familiar name. We just talked about him last week here at 39. I already expounded upon his game. The only thing that I'll add is that I watched his on-ball creation and playmaking a little bit more, which is why at his height,
Leonard Miller is who we're talking about.
I was going to name drop it. Him, but the ball handling, the creativity with the passing, I think that there is a little bit of that same kind of gameplay as an Ousmane Dieng, is that he's not as, penetrable, when he's got the ball in his hand, getting to that second level of the defense. I think Ousmane will be able to do a little bit better. But Leonard Miller, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on him because we talked about him last week, but he did make the leap to 39 specifically because with the intersection of height and on-ball skill, I think that warranted moving him up a little bit more on the list.
I wouldn't have even blamed you if you moved him up into the top 30. Not that you necessarily want to slap like a first round grade on him, but again, just to reiterate, I think he is going to go in the first round. So anybody who wants to put him there and they want to project more of what they feel NBA teams are going to do versus not just specifically and strictly their own opinions, I think that would be a smart play. So having him closer to that first round range, I don't mind that you moved him up a little bit, even though, I may be in the same boat as you. I don't necessarily want to slap a first round grade on him either, but there's also just the reality of what NBA teams are going to be looking like. He's a very raw prospect, but you just look at his tools and how tantalizing the potential can be. That usually just moves guys up into that first round territory. So that's where I do think he's going to go.
Yeah, and sharing a little bit of my draft philosophy with the folks here at Draft Deeper, I usually, when there's a guy that, and I kind of learned this from Rucker a little bit, is that when there's a guy
who's buzzing,
you
learned something from Rucker. Oh no, I don't.
Yeah, I know that we're not supposed to admit whenever Rucker is right, but he's taught me a lot. And one of the things that I kind of shared, but the way that he explains it is much better than I ever could, is that whenever there's a guy that's buzzing, like I want to have the preconceived notion that I'm not gonna like him, and then I go into a game watching him saying, I'm not going to like you. What can you show me? And then Leonard Miller showed me something. And then I was like, all right, cool. You showed me a little bit of something. Bet you can't do it again. Then I went back and watched him. He did it again. So I'm not going to say that this is a finalized spot on him because of how new on the scene that he is for me personally.
Sure.
But there is still a lot to like about him. So the on-ball creation with the 6'10", 6'11", I think he gets an inch taller every time I talk about him. But, we moved him up. So we'll move on to another, shot creator, another guy that we trust with the ball in his hands. Nathan,
now we're really getting into the meat and potatoes of the big boards. This is much more interesting.
Now we're starting to hit some of these bigger names, like names that every team should at least have on their radar with a first round potential grade. That's where we're starting to get with these guys. You could have probably said the same thing about Koloko because of how NBA ready I think he is positionally. Yep. Probably said the same thing about Leonard Miller. Now we can definitely say that about a guy in Alondas Williams. We talked about him with great friend of the show. Love him to death. Rashard Phillips, RP3, the great Yoda, #Yoda. Alondas Williams out of Wake Forest. Just a lot to love, man. Like when we went on the Topic Thunder podcast, Nathan, and they asked us, the superlative, who's the best passer in the draft. I think you and I both unanimously agreed that Alondas Williams is the best passer. And listening to you and Chuck talk about him and that, okay, like how much of this guy, how much is there that you can mold? How much of his game is malleable enough to where you say, all right, dude, like we get it. You can make these crazy passes, but it's almost like you do it to default. There was one play, I can't remember who the entry pass was potentially going to be to, but he declined an easy entry pass for a bucket for a whip pass, and it was a turnover. But I didn't count that as like like he's a bad decision maker. The fact that he's dynamic and talented enough and confident enough to be able to see and attempt that, I think that speaks a lot to his game. Now he's another one of these older prospects, Nathan, that is probably going to get a knock specifically because of his age. Defensively, I don't know where I like him on the floor. Like he's big enough to be like a good guard defender, but I don't know if in certain lineups if he's going to be asked to do too much out on the perimeter on some other positions. So that kind of limits him a little bit defensively to me. He's kind of built like James Harden, big barrel chested guy. Like maybe if there's a switch, do we like him on some of these kind of?
I think he's going to be fine from a team defensive concept. Yeah. I don't know if I agree with you. I don't know if he's like your ultimate answer at the point of attack, but
yeah,
in terms of just like fitting into a team scheme, I think he's ultimately going to be fine at the NBA level, because who knows, maybe he's never like this awesome starting NBA point guard, although it wouldn't shock me if he got to that point. But if he's one of these guys who you're primarily bringing him off the bench for the instant offense, right?
Yeah.
The awesome transition, explosive scoring, the wicked awesome passes where he can get everybody involved on a second unit or mixing and matching him between starters and bench guys. That's really why, in my opinion, you would draft him, not necessarily for a lot of the defensive stuff. So I know where you're going, but yeah. I don't think in his particular case, it's going to matter as much because his offensive value could just tremendously outweigh the defensive stuff if you're playing him in more limited minutes.
Absolutely. Just trying to give a quick, overall breakdown of his game. 100% agree with you. You're not drafting Alondas Williams for his defense. But speaking of his offense, Nathan, concerns about the efficiency on the jump shot, like that might be a real critique for him, so how improved can his jump shot be? I think that there's a lot to like there. in the long term. And again, depending on the team that takes him, they might be able to expedite, the improvement on his jump shot. But his ability to get past, the initial defender, I think that he's the most comfortable when the defense is gravitating to him. And then he can say, okay, like, do I want to take this guy off the bounce and finish myself? Or can I just make the defense look dumb for collapsing around me and kick it out to a teammate for an open jump shot? So a lot to like about him there.
So the thing about the jump shot is he's actually rated out good on jump shots off the dribble, 64th percentile for synergy. The other interesting statistic to know about his jump shot, when we talk about he's not the best spot up player, right?
Yeah.
However, in unguarded catch and shoot situations, he rated out in the 53rd percentile, which would be good. He made 37% of those shots. That's really all you need him to do, in my opinion.
Just be okay.
From a jump shot perspective. Just be good enough to where you bring the defense out for that hard closeout, and then he can get around guys because he is that explosive off that first step. And once he gets into the next level of that defense, his passing vision is some of the best in the class. He can make passes at ridiculous angles once he gets into that next layer of the defense. So really, I don't need him to be this spot up killer like Malachi Brandon, for example.
Correct.
I just need him to be good enough in open catch and shoot situations to attract the defense and attract defenders to close out so that he can break through that next level.
Yeah, we want him to keep defenses honest. We want him to be respectable from deep. And if that's the case, is him being like a second or, a third playmaker on a team, my goodness, like the potential is there. And I think that his athleticism kind of, disrespectfully gets knocked. But I mean, the amount of dunks that this kid has put up during the season is just flat out.
He wants to dunk over you. You could tell he was probably watching too many John Morant highlights at one point. It was like, man, if this is what I need to do to get on people's first round of the boards, I'll do it.
Yeah, I think this guy was made to play basketball in the, the Gilbert Arenas, Baron Davis, Steve Francis era of basketball. And it's fun that we're starting to see guards like these who just want to kill you when they have the ball in their hands in the NBA now. And Alondas Williams might be kind of that helping that next wave of, I want to take you off the bounce and embarrass you guards.
It's also kind of like a common theme too, before we move on to the next guy,
sure.
That like, it's a lot easier to rein somebody into than to teach them how to be more aggressive or how to be more creative on the offensive. You would rather rein in the creativity as opposed to trying to bring more out of a player that maybe it's not there for them. Maybe they're just not that type of guy on the court. So that's, I think, another reason why you and I would rather have Alondas.
But not a reason that we would want to get a JD Davison, because he has a lot of physical things to like about him too, but the basketball ability is a little bit questionable there. So we'll move on. We'll keep it nice. And Nathan, how long do you want to talk about your guy here at 37? We got Christian Brown out of Kansas. We had a great
I've hammered home my points, Steven. You can, I will just let you take the floor and then we can move to another guy. I've said my piece about Christian Brown.
Yeah, I mean, he's more your guy than he is my guy. I've had him flirting with late first round grades. I'm perfectly content with where I have him here at 37. I think that the off-ball potential with him is there. I don't know how much I want the ball in his hand, which is fine. Not everybody in the NBA is meant to be a creator with the ball in their hands, right? Defensively, he's okay. I'm not asking him to take on the other team's best player, but if he's guarding like the fourth or fifth best player on a team, then he's probably going to be just fine in a team construct with that. The 3-point shot is it turned around for him this season. Would like to see him be a little bit more aggressive and actually hunt that shot a little bit instead of just, taking that obligatory jab step to the right, dribble to the left, instead of just pulling up whenever he has a shot available to him. So confidence is not an issue with this guy at all. We talked about that on the show that we broke down his game. I think he's a pro. I just don't know at what level of a pro that you're getting him. And there's even the possibility that he goes back to Kansas too, Nathan. So that might have weighed in a little bit to where I have him. So I got him here at 37.
No, I really don't have much of anything else to add to the conversation. And that's really, it's not because I don't want to talk about Christian Brown, but I think, I made my positive points about him. Tyler Rucker's made his positive points about him. We had CJ Moore on the show to give us more insight as to who Christian Brown is as a person, not just a basketball player. He checks a lot of boxes, but if you don't buy more of the on-ball stuff, getting better in the half court, and you don't buy the jump shot as much as I would, for example, you're not going to have a first round grade on him. And to be honest, I don't even have a first round grade on him anymore. I have him just outside the first. I have him like 5 spots higher than you do. So honestly, like I don't knock where you have him. I think he's a top 40 guy for sure. But there's plenty of valid reasons that are backed up by the numbers to not have a first round grade on him. So I think overall you have him in a good range.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Makes me feel better about my evaluation there, Nathan. So we'll move to a prospect that we recently just discussed on the show with Jeff Polishek, who had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with these overtime elite prospects. At 36, I have Jean Montero, the guard from the overtime elite. Now, I even brought up one comparison on that very show that I have been suppressing for a long time, but I can't hold it back anymore. Gives me a little bit of young Tony Parker vibes, man. You know, a guy who I don't know how much you trust the jump shot overall. If you watch his overtime play, he had no problems taking a variety of different types of three-point shots off the dribble, guarded, unguarded, pull up from the parking lot, from right toe on the line. You know, he was experimenting a lot with that three-point shot. The finishing around the basket, I think, is kind of sneaky nice. And obviously the defense is something that you can fall in love with too. You know, he's not one of these big guards that is kind of all in vogue in the NBA now. He's about 6'1", 6'2", a little bit slight of frame, has a lot of pro experience though. We talked about that on the episode with Josh, where, you know, he has, Jacob, I'm getting all these J's mixed up in my head. Jacob Polishek. Shout out to Jacob.
Yeah, come on. We can shout out to Jacob, man. We can't slight him like that.
No, and he just released a great article on Zag's blog that I just read too. But back to Jean Montero. It's just, we're going to learn a lot about how to evaluate overtime elite with how good Jean Montero does when he comes into the NBA. I compare it a lot to the first season of the G League Ignite, you know, where it's just hard to evaluate that wide of a chasm in talent that you're playing against on a consistent basis. And to his credit, Jean Montero was the big fish for the overtime elite, and he played like it. So it would be completely different if he looked out of his element when he went to overtime elite, but he didn't. So you put all that into a bottle and you shake it up and you pour it out. I got 36, Nathan. I don't know where you have him.
I have him in a similar range. I think John is just going to be one of these guys. He's going to go late first round to a really good NBA team. We're going to hope that team figures out how to utilize him properly. You made the Tony Parker comparison. That may not be too far off base, because Tony Parker once upon a time went 28th in the first round of his respective draft. So it's not like John's going to be in a non-similar range. Like, that's probably where he's going to go. And the biggest questions, again, they come back to the jump shot, which is something that we asked Jacob. Jacob does buy into the jump shooting, and he buys into more of the finishing creativity around the basket as well, that is Tony Parker's biggest selling point for his entire career, was that he was one of the best under the basket finishers that we've seen at the guard spot in NBA history. There's certainly a number of names that you throw into that basket. Modern, I don't want to say modern day, but I guess right now you say Kyrie Irving is the best at that we have in the NBA right now. But you would put Tony Parker in that all-time conversation with that skill set. So is John able to get himself into that conversation one day? That, to me, other than the open three-point shooting, will be the biggest thing. Will that killer speed be able to be utilized more around the basket? Will he get a little bigger, a little stronger, and be able to finish over the trees? Or will some of that not be able to translate because he is turnover prone? He can be a little wild with the basketball. He has passing creativity, but it's not in the same. It's not the same to me as like when we talk about Alondas, for example. Like, Alondas has more of that vision to match the creativity. It's not just that Alondas is willing to just fling the ball all over the court, spray it all over the place, but he sees a lot of things that defenses honestly just don't see. I don't know if John has that type of vision to back up some of the creativity, which is why he's a little more turnover prone, can get a little loose with the dribble. So there are some question marks about him, but the natural raw talent, the speed at the guard position, and if more of the scoring and the shooting does come together, like, we could be talking about somebody who ends up having top 20, top 14 type of value, like he was once projected to have in this draft. And for that reason, I'm actually kind of glad if he goes in like a late first, early second range, because he's probably going to go to a good team who will be better at figuring out how to properly use him than a lottery team that might not have as much talent. And then he kind of like, falls into some of the similar bad habits that he did watching the Overtime Elite film.
Yeah, we just don't want him to go to Brooklyn where they have point guards guarding power forwards, because Kevin
That
Durant
would not be good either.
That would not be good. But, I can't shake the Tony Parker vibes. I'm not saying that, Jean Montero equals Tony Parker, but there's a lot of similarities.
No, I like the name. Like if he hits his absolute apex, like we could be looking at a similar type of outcome. We can't project that these guys are going to win like as many championships as the Spurs did, but just in terms of like on-court play style and production, like he could get to a similar point if he hits. I think there's just going to be a lot that needs to go into it for him to get there. But the fact that we can have that type of conversation about him, I think that the range that he's in right now is probably where he should be at.
Fair enough. And we'll roll right into a no ceilings darling here at 35. We're talking about Santa Clara Jalen Williams, a name that's rising up multiple outlets, boards, in particular ours as well. We haven't got to our latest big board war room yet, but I have a feeling, Nathan, that Jalen Williams is going to come up higher than where I have him.
He already did for me. I can just spoil that for the folks at home. I have a first round grade on him.
And Nathan, I'm going to tell you the truth. I could pick players 27 through 35 and rearrange them in any sort of order and sleep comfortably at night with where I have them. Like I could have him as high as 28, but when we start getting to these names that I have above them, I think that the margin of talent like is paper thin. It's like deli cut lunch meat thin. How like close these guys are in talent. And if you go back, and I said this at the time when I watched him play Chet Holmgren, he was not afraid to go at one of the best. Like we're talking about Chet Holmgren as we should, as a generational shot blocker. Jalen Williams attacked him off the bounce, wasn't afraid of him. Oh, by the way, this guy's a great 3-point shooter. Oh, by the way, he's a competent defender. Like there's a lot to like about his game, but I don't know how much of what he showed at college is going to translate to an NBA level, to what we saw in college. I could think the shot is an NBA level. I think the team defense is an NBA level. I don't know about the shot creation, the attack you off the bounce being at an NBA level positionally, but I think as a rotational guy, potentially like 4th, 5th best guy in your rotation, I think that is there for him. He's got NBA size too. It's just, again, when we get in this conversation of 28 through 35, I have mixed feelings about where I have them. I'll be completely transparent.
I think the thing that's going to potentially scare off NBA teams is just the fact that he's coming from Santa Clara. He's not coming from a big time program. And that matters to some people. We talk about like who actually gets drafted in like that late first round range. It is generally guys from these power programs who maybe couldn't showcase all of their skills right at the college level, but NBA teams want to bet on them and take a chance because of where they ranked out, like where were they RSCI, where were they ESPN top 100, what did that film look like? Those are the types of bets the teams want to make in that range, not always the small school guys. Like Jalen Williams probably, if I had to guess, would have like a very similar grade on NBA boards to where you have him. I'm buying a little more into the talent to have him firmly in the first round at this point. And honestly, the only real nitpick that I can bring to light, Steven, is agreeing with you similarly to like the off the bounce stuff, just at the rim. Some of the at the rim finishing, I've seen the clips where he can get off the ground off 2 feet. He can finish a dunk. He's had some creative finishes both with his right hand as well as his left hand. Yep. I just, the types of angles that he gets those shots off at and how difficult he makes some of those shots look. I don't know if all of that is going to translate at the NBA level, but at the same time, I don't really see NBA teams putting him in a position to finish those types of shots at volume at those difficult angles either. So like that ends up becoming more of a nitpick than a true criticism, in my opinion. When you look at everything else he does well, 86th percentile scoring out of pick and roll, 97th percentile on spot ups, 83rd percentile in transition, 71st percentile in isolation sets, numbers including passes look great. 86th percentile on runners. Like his floater game, he actually has really nice touch on a floater. And then the piece that really ties everything together, apart from the awesome pick and roll defense. I think that 34th percentile in terms of total defense rating is because Santa Clara wasn't always the best defensive team as a whole.
Defensive numbers are kind of like team skewed. Like people know that. That's, and
we've talked about that. Yeah. But his individual defense of the pick and roll, best in my opinion in the entire draft class. If you need something to do, go watch Jalen Williams defending the pick and roll. But the offensive skill that ties everything together is the catch and shoot number. 97th percentile on catch and shoot shots, 48% from the field on catch and shoot looks. That shot is going to translate. It's money, it's butter. And when you have a guy that lethal in the catch and shoot game, who, when he's run off of his spots, can keep the ball moving, can make passes, underrated passer. If he gets to the basket, hopefully he can deploy some of those more creative finishes that we saw in college. And then defensively, I just think he's going to be a much better on-the-ball defender as well as a team guy, like you said, than initially given credit for. And he has the NBA size, the NBA body to come in and play multiple positions in the backcourt. So I think whether he's a long-time starter or he's just like a really good bench guy for a good team to be able to deploy, I just think he's a long-term NBA guy, man. And shout out to Tyler Rucker, shout out to some other people in the mainstream draft space who have been in on him even longer than you and I have. It's not about being first to the party. It's about realizing what goes into the evaluation, why the evaluation is the way that it is, and ultimately trying to get it right to the best of your ability. And I'm buying all in on Jalen Williams. I think he's a first-round grade. But like I said, you probably have him in a range that a lot of NBA teams do, so I don't fault you for where you have him.
Yeah, and, just people that I trust in NBA circles who I know are making phone calls to front offices and things like that, NBA teams are liking him. Like they're really looking forward to getting this guy in workouts and things like that. So it's not just a niche part of draft Twitter.
No, he's a lock top 40 guy in NBA front offices. Like that's not up for debate. This guy's getting a guaranteed contract of some sort.
Absolutely. So we'll move on from one Williams to another, and that is, of course, everyone at No Ceilings knows that I can't say this guy's name enough. Vince Williams Jr. out of Virginia Commonwealth.
If you're playing Stephen Gillaspie bingo at home, there you go. We got Vince Williams Jr. off the board.
You just won the lottery, my friend, because at 34, Nathan he does everything so daggone well. Like he's 6'6". He played power forward for VCU. I think that he's got some three equity in the NBA. He's a really good three-point shooter. He's a very, very, very good underrated passer, especially positionally. He might be the best, four-man passer in this draft class. He's an awesome defender. He switches. He's good in the post. He's stronger than he looks. He rebounds. It's just the only thing that I don't think that he's going to do and in the NBA is pretty much anything where you're asking him to create with the ball in his hand outside of maybe a short roller, a dribble or two when being chased off the line. Like that's it. I think that this is a longtime NBA guy. I liken him to players like Torrey Craig, Jay Crowder, Dorian Finney-Smith, who we see, exploding for Dallas right now because of the team construct around him. He's a value contract in the NBA. Vince Williams Jr. offers you a lot of those same things, does everything well, doesn't really do anything elite, but I think, that versatility just positionally, I think is elite. Like if you could classify like some sort of scouting, niche thing, like how his versatility is elite, if that makes sense. Like not one category I would say like puts him over the edge, but positionally his passing might. This guy is just going to be able to do so much for an NBA team. I really like him a lot, Nathan.
Yeah, you and I have different evaluations on him, that you have more nicer things to say about him than I do. I don't think he's a bad player, and I don't think he's a bad prospect. I would agree with you in that I think he's more of a gadget guy. And we look back at some of these drafts and we go, what kind of draft capital are we putting into? It's a little echo to your old show there, but
yeah.
What
shout
kind
out to the rest in peace.
Shout out to OG draft capital. But what kind of draft capital are we putting into a guy who is probably going to be a little bit of a journeyman throughout his NBA career, right? Like, I don't know if we're drafting this guy and we're definitely going to bring him in on an extension, get him to a second contract with the team who drafted him. I honestly don't have the answer to that question. Could it happen? Absolutely. But guys, you brought up Dorian Finney-Smith. That's not a bad name. Dorian Finney-Smith has kind of, they found a home in Dallas because they wanted to find ways to use him in the right ways. And I think that Vince Williams Jr. is a guy who can absolutely stick around in the NBA if a team's willing to sort of not game plan for him, but put him out there in ways to play to his strengths, if that makes sense. And if that's the case, he could provide value on both sides of the ball. And really, we were talking about some guys in our group chat today, some of these older guys that are coming from these smaller schools. And I know we didn't have Jalen Williams in that mix, but we could have technically
very well
him
could
in
have,
there to an extent, not a senior, but an older guy, quote unquote, in the draft class technically. But Vince Williams Jr. would be in that conversation of guys who I could see outperforming potential draft stock because his defensive impact is really what brings me to him the most. I get some of the offensive stuff. I don't know if the jumper is going to be as good at the NBA level as it's been advertised. Like, does the jumper get to like a Dorian Finney-Smith level? Like Dorian Finney-Smith, although he can't really do a lot off the bounce either, which is why I kind of like that comp. Finney-Smith did become like at times, like he can be a potential microwave, like nuclear type of catch and shoot guy. Like that dude can get hot and he can stroke it in a hurry. And I think that's more or less why he's stuck around in Dallas and has played such a key role for them, along with everything he brings to the table defensively. So can Vince Williams Jr. be that type of shooter in the NBA because you're not going to trust him to do all the same things off the bounce offensively? That would be the biggest holdup for me. But I agree with you. If you're not asking him to do too much with the ball in his hands, he can be a play finisher. He can be hopefully a catch and shoot guy. He can be a guy who he's not making all of these awesome passes on the move, but he can keep the ball moving from his spots, if that makes sense. So there are a lot of things to like, and I recognize them. I just don't know if I want to spend a top 35 pick on that guy. I think it's more just a difference in philosophy between us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you have a guy who you will openly admit may have a higher ceiling than a Vince Williams Jr., but could be out of
some of these guys I just might want to take more of a bet on somebody.
They could be out of the league in a year or two, whereas
they could be out of the league.
We talk about guys like Jay Crowder, Torrey Craig, and Dorian Finney-Smith. Like, sure, these guys might be journeymen, but every playoff team wants them. There's value to that.
Let's not forget though, Jay Crowder was a star at Marquette. Well, when we throw that name around, that dude did a lot with the ball in his hands at Marquette, probably than given credit for. So I know off-ball NBA contender, Miami Heat, Phoenix Suns, Jay Crowder's like he's a different
Cleveland,
player than he was in college.
All of those,
different role, different player. But to his credit, like some of these guys who come in and ultimately play these roles in the NBA, they did a lot more in college than they were initially given credit for. They didn't come into the NBA the same player as like a Vince Williams Jr., for example, who we already have some of these questions about some of the on-ball type of creativity. We didn't have those questions in the same way when we were evaluating like college Jay Crowder, for example. He kind of had to come in and ultimately scale down his role.
Yeah.
We already sort of have that answer about somebody like a Vince Williams Jr. So that leaves some of the upside a little more capped, in my opinion, than some of the other guys we talked about.
For sure. But when we're talking, and for me, like when we're talking about like NBA role, like that's kind of like where I see him at his like peak value. I think is probably Jay Crowder. Like if everything hits right, you're getting a guy who every NBA playoff team wants, and he could add value there. So We'll move on now to 33, to a player who I have said, and I will eat crow right now, because I have said all season long that Wendell Moore Jr. is a first round talent in the NBA. I wrote about him on, the Weekend Warrior. I said, what more do you want? He could still very well prove me wrong. But again, 28 through 35, depending on the day, like I could feel differently. Like I don't feel good about where I have Wendell Moore Jr. I want to put him higher. But when we're talking about a guy who we're kind of at a question with him that we talk about with tweeners at the 3 and the 4 or the 4 and the 5 and how that's not good. Like it's a little bit more forgivable for Wendell Moore Jr. to be like, is he a 1, 2, maybe even in some lineups a 3? It's more forgivable on the perimeter to be able to do that. But is he ever going to be a guy that you say, let's run some offense through him? I'm not sure, but what I can tell you is that he is going to be another one of these 3-and-D guys. He is going to be a good connector piece, and he's probably going to play in the NBA for a long time. And again, when we're talking about ceiling versus floor, how volatile of a prospect are you willing to take a swing on? I think Wendell Moore Jr. is one of these more safe guys, like one of these singles that we talk about, Nathan. That's what I look at him at the NBA, because at 6'5", 6'6", ball handling, 3-point shooting, good positional defender, some creation ability, but I don't think that that's going to be, his bread and butter in the NBA. I feel a little bit safer taking him at 33 than I do at 29 or 30.
He's one of these guys, I think, that we've pegged all year in private circles when we have some of these meetings that we do, as a guy who we think he's likely to go in the first round, because an NBA team is just going to take a swing on the fact that he made some drastic improvements from a scoring perspective this year. And he's one of these guys who, he's a junior in college, but he's still young for a junior. So I think those two things are really going to work in his favor. But I think the highest selling point for Wendell Moore, when he was being talked about as like a top 20 pick, is this a guy who, as you said, can you funnel enough offense through him to justify him growing into like a third option type of role on an NBA team? Or is he much better as kind of like a guy who maybe you bring him in off the bench, or maybe he's like your fifth option in a starting lineup, and he's there to just kind of get to certain spots, and you're able to get him some open shots, and at his best, he can make those open shots. That could be true for him if a lot of these spot up improvements, a lot of these catch and shoot improvements, like if he's as good by the numbers as he was in those particular areas in the NBA as he was this past year, then he's a first round pick. But again, we can't really sell the creator role for Wendell Moore at the next level. And I know that he took over a lot of the lead ball handling duties earlier in the year for Duke, but there's a point where some of the numbers turn on him and some of the efficiency and the tape really turned on him in that role. Like Duke kind of had to turn the keys over to Jeremy Roach, and then to an extent, Paolo Banchero as well.
Absolutely, Paolo Banchero.
For that team. And then when we saw Wendell Moore able to play off of other people and show more of, hey, if I get to this spot, I can make this shot. That's when he looked like a much better player, when he was able to kind of step into some of those mid-range type pull-ups, when he was able to catch open threes, catch the ball from the corner and hit like these open threes. Like that's when he looked like a much better version of Wendell Moore. If that's the player that we're getting at that efficiency, great. Let's slap the first round green on him. If he regresses to an extent in some of those areas shooting basketball, then you kind of get to like that second round territory on him. So really it's how much do you trust the improvement in the spot up game, in the catch and shoot game? If you do, take him in the first round. If you have questions, you probably do feel better about taking him like anywhere from 30 to 35.
Yeah, and he very well still could be a first round guy, depending on players that
he could be
want to withdraw their name. I mean, like depending on who declares and stays for this draft, he could work his way in there. I feel more comfortable at 33 than I did, maybe a week or so ago, Nathan. So moving to 32, I didn't think that this was going to happen, but it happened. I have Kendall Brown as a second round player. Now, he is at like the top 1% of this draft class in terms of just like explosive athleticism, Nathan. I've said it all year long. He's a guy that has to try harder to stay on the ground than he does having to jump in the air. But as a guy who was tabbed as a defender, he lost a lot of his luster on that side of the ball. We talked about the 10 assist game. I don't know if he had a 3 assist game after that. The shooting had a false bottom, as everyone pretty much suspecting that it did at the beginning of the season, when I think he was at like 72% or something like that within like the first month of the season. Because when that volume kind of ticked up, we saw that it went away. A player that lost a lot of confidence, in my opinion, as the season went on. And when you're not confident and there's questions, like, sure, there's potential there, but like to some people, potential are red flags. And that's kind of where I am now with Kendall Brown. There's just a lot more players that I trust who I think have more confidence in their game and know who they are as a basketball player. And I don't know if I could say the same thing about Kendall Brown right now.
I came down on Kendall Brown as well, and took me quite a while to get to that point. But especially in the tournament. I mean, we saw Jeremy Sohan just absolutely take off in some respects in the tournament. It's not that he was, shooting the absolute lights out of the ball or like putting up like 25 plus points, but like he's just so much more coordinated of a ball handler, of a decision maker, of a guy who you can trust both on and off the ball defensively. And Kendall Brown, there was a point in the year where he was incredibly hyper efficient, right? Mm-hmm. From all kinds of numbers you can look at, he was incredibly hyper efficient. And to this day, at the end of the season, he rated out in the 89th percentile in terms of total offense on synergy. You want to know why? Because he was in the 83rd percentile in transition, and he's in the 94th percentile on cuts. And that's all he did at a very good or excellent level. You look at everything else, spot up shooting, putbacks, getting involved in the offensive glass, pick and roll type of sets. Those numbers, including passes, shooting jump shots. Like, unless he had an open lane to the basket, he really wasn't doing much of anything else. And to his credit, I think there is still more to be unlocked with the passing. Like, I don't think that I don't think the double-digit assist game was just like a pure fluke out of absolute nowhere. But in order to be able to take advantage of that passing creativity, you have to be a threat to score the basketball. Otherwise, teams are just going to know that you want to pass, and they're going to play to that. They're going to force turnovers. They're going to turn you over. And then you couple in those offensive concerns with the fact that defensively, he was pretty much average to below average over the course of the entire year. Off the ball, he was an absolute mess. And I do believe these defensive metrics, because there are a number of defenders on Baylor who rated out well defensively per the synergy metrics. But I believe the percentiles for Kendall Brown, 31st percentile in terms of total defense, man defense, 20th percentile. When you have that many series of offensive questions, along with the little to no impact defensively, other than every now and then you're able to play a passing lane or get a quick hand on the ball, like, why do I need to necessarily take you any higher than like the top, or take you in like the top 25 of the draft? Like, why do I need to take you higher? I'm really struggling to come up with a good reason why, other than just the very raw athletic tools. And that's not going to get it done. He all of a sudden became one of these players who I wish would go back to school for another year. And quite frankly, I can still see that being the case, because he would really have to shoot the piss out of the ball in workouts for me to believe that NBA teams are going to have comfort taking him with a top 20 pick when this guy was at one point projected top 10. Why would you want to lose out on him?
And if you're advising him, do you want him taking jump shots in a gym in front of scouts, Nathan?
I think you kind of have to. You got to at one point prove whether you can, make the shots. And I would certainly hope he's making all of his jump shots in an open gym setting. But
we see Josh Minot putting out jump shooting videos right now. Like, I haven't seen anything on Kendall Brown.
There's just too many question marks to the point where I'd be shocked if him and his agent really wanted to settle on where his draft stock is at right now. Why not work on a whole bunch of different things over the summer, get the feedback from testing the waters that you need, come back to school for a second year, put more of your offensive game together, show that you can be better defensively. And then maybe we're starting to talk about him in some of the same ranges that we were at the beginning of the year. But yeah,
Nathan, I had this guy like fifth at one point. I think
we had him like sixth,
January or February. I had him in my top 5.
That's what happens when you don't see enough guys right off the bat. You kind of only have so much film and so many numbers to work off of. But now that we have the full season's worth, and we kind of kept asking ourselves, like, is he going to show more? Is he going to show more? Is he going to show more? And he never did. And when it's one thing to talk about potential versus production when there are enough reasons to believe that even if some of the production wasn't there, some of the flashes warranted buying into further production down the road. In a lot of respects, we didn't even get that with Kendall Brown this year. So like, that's when you really have to do as you're doing with your board, Steven, and bring production in as more of a weight than it could be for some of these other prospects. So I don't blame you for having him where you do. Like, I can't come up with a defense to have him any higher than like, I think 26 or 27, which is where Sam Vecini and Matt Penny just took him on a mock draft podcast over at Game Theory.
I can tell you right now, you're going to like who I have directly in front of him at 31, and that's Bryce McGowan. And Nathan, I'm telling you the truth when I say this. I tried so hard. I tried so hard to get him in my first round. Like, I understand the create, and let's speak glowingly of him. I don't even want to talk about anything bad with him because I do like him this much. Like a guy who doesn't have great 3-point shooting, but can attack the basket the way that he does. Nathan, I compared him to DeMar DeRozan. Like I think that there's a lot of similarities there. Like he may not ever be a great 3-point shooter, but
you're preaching to the choir with that comp. Come on, man. You're preaching to the choir.
His drive, like his attacking the basket, his even though he's a little bit more slim, his ability to get past the initial defender, the finishing ability is there, the free throw ability is there. Because of his team, like I want to believe that the passing ability is going to be unlocked even more with better spacing and a more open floor and better teammates around him. Defensively, there's concerns there. DeMar DeRozan wasn't really ever one to be a top-notch level defender, so there's similarities there. When I get to the names that I have in front of him, it's just really, really hard for me, man, to fight to put him up any higher. But again, from 28 through 35, like I might have him at 28 at some point, but I do love Bryce McGowan for a lot of the same reason, Nathan. I believe we're watching the same guy. I just think this is where draft philosophy comes in and why you're more high on him than I am.
Yeah, I've said on multiple fronts that like I have a top 20 grade on him. And as I talked about with Chuck on the last podcast, I think it's one of the more risky propositions you can make in the top 20 because there's a very realistic chance where his basement floor, he bottoms out even lower than where you have him on a board right now. Not everything comes together for him. I've seen enough, though, from a confidence standpoint. And like we wanted to talk about on some other podcasts, that confidence really matters to me. The fact that he's willing to go inside and get around the basket and take a beating and get to the line, that really matters for me. The fact that he's confident and willing to pull up on those mid-range jumpers, on those catch-and-shoot looks, that matters to me. These guys who are 6'7" with the length, who can shoot over defenders, not just rely on going through somebody or over them, but shoot and score over them from the perimeter. Like these are the types of guys that NBA teams are looking for, these legitimate 3-level scorers. But a lot of it is theoretical for him right now.
Yeah.
And that's where I don't know where he's going to go on draft night. I'd like to believe that some of the buzz that I'm hearing from behind the scenes, the NBA teams are looking at him with like a top 15, top 20 pick. I'd like to believe that. But if he's one of these guys that falls on draft night, I'll understand why. Because the best Bryce McGowans that I can talk about by the numbers and by good portions of the tape is theoretical than anything else. Like comparing him to DeMar DeRozan, like old, like Toronto Raptors, DeMar DeRozan, like very young in his career, DeMar DeRozan, like that's great. But DeMar DeRozan has gone through evolutions in his career that I don't know if Bryce McGowan is going to go through in his career either. Like the passing is unbelievable from DeRozan later in his career. Like talk about the transformation he made in San Antonio in particular, to now come to Chicago where you can quite literally run your entire offense through DeMar DeRozan. He's not just a pull-up scorer. He's so much more than that. That's a level I don't know if that's in the cards for Bryce. As lethal of a scoring threat as he could turn into in time, how lethal of a pure offensive scoring threat. I don't know if some of these other things on offense are going to come together for him, as well as the defensive concerns that you and I, as well as others, probably share. So it's going to be really interesting to see who takes him and who has a really firm plan in place to be able to develop him. Otherwise, he's one of these guys who I could see slip into the cracks.
Yeah, and just I've said it before, I'll say it again.
But I'm betting on McGowan's offense.
I know you are. And here's, again, kind of playing into the philosophy piece of it. If you're a late first, early second round guy, unless you're blowing it away, like unless you're blowing your coaches out of the water with how great you are doing in your practices, shout out to Herb Jones again. If you're not blowing them away to where you're just like, all right, we got to get this kid on the floor, like he's just doing too good in practice, you're not getting the ball in your hands. And that's where I get afraid for Bryce McGowan is, the team that drafts him, you said it best, Nathan, the team that drafts him has to have a firm plan in place because you don't want to take away what he does best, which is playing with the ball in his hands. I don't think that an off-ball role for him is best suited early on in his NBA career. He has to have some reps as a creator in order for him to reach his, like, absolute peak value, and it's got to happen early.
But he can do things off the ball, though. He like his catch and shoot numbers were good. I think he can be a better cutter. Like there are things, and his transition, his ability to finish and trip. Like there are things he can do off the ball to provide value immediately. But I agree with you. That's not the version of Bryce McGowens you want to draft. You want to draft the on-ball 3-level dynamo Bryce McGowens.
Yeah, and I trust him more off the ball than I do Blake Wesley, and I'll leave it at that. So rounding out the segment, Nathan, another no ceilings favorite. I wanted to have him higher. He could very well go higher. Like we might talk about this guy next week. I'm just real quick, like shout out to the show for next week because I'm excited to get into some of these other names. But rounding out at number 30, I have Jake LaRavia out of Wake Forest. Nathan, we've talked about him. Chuck's talked about him. Everybody at No Ceilings talked about him. Corey Tulaba had a great interview with him and Kevin McCullough, a great video. Great audio to listen to, just insight that we're getting about this guy, what he's working on in his downtime right now before the draft. Just, I love him, man. Like I watched the Duke film and I'm just like, okay, this guy has the defensive versatility to guard Paulo Banchero effectively and Trevor Keels. You're talking about a 4 and a 1 at the collegiate level. Both have NBA draft prospects, and Jake LaRavia, oh, by the way, he's younger than what we thought. So if that's important to you, he's not 22, he's 20. So that might vault him up automatically because all of a sudden he's a better player and younger now. But overall, man, like Jake LaRavia does so much. He's 6'8", he's bigger than Vince Williams Jr., but he gives you a lot of the same things, but he's bigger, younger. And I like his on-ball creativity a little bit more than Vince Williams Jr. So a lot of the same roles and responsibility, in my opinion, between the two players, but he's bigger, younger. I think that he's got a little bit more on-ball equity. And if you're a firm believer in the jump shot, which it sounds like you're going to be, Nathan, from everything that I've heard when I've heard you speak about him or write about him, I think that there's just way too much that this kid has going on right now to where he's not going to be at least a first-round pick. So right now I have him 30. Next week, Nathan, we might talk about him a little bit more. I might slide him up.
I've got him in the same spot. And I won't say too much about his game because you and I have broken it down, and I just talked to Chuck on the last episode to get
great
more
show, by the way.
Shout
out to Chuck. Shout out to Chuck. He's the best.
We know Chuck's the legend. Your friend and mine.
I'm so sad, Chuck, by the way, that I couldn't tell my Jabari Walker joke to him on the show about like you can't name 60 players better than Jabari Walker. It's like, yeah, but you might be able to name 57. You know?
I got it in for you though, Steven. I got it.
I heard.
The one thing I'll say about LaRavia before we cut this podcast to an end is that I think Sam Vecini on that mock draft podcast that I referenced that he just released with Matt Penny, him taking him at 23 on that mock, I think is more of an indication, not just in his line of thinking, but also really in where NBA front offices are going to view a forward like him with that much skill. Like Sam talks to enough people behind the scenes where he doesn't just pull those comments and those evaluations out of nowhere.
He's pretty plugged in, yeah.
He's fairly plugged in, I would say. So I think the more teams get to view some of these workout videos that are coming out, when they get to see him in different workout settings, I think they're going to dig back even harder into the film. And they're going to see a lot of the tools that you and I were able to notice. And I know Chuck likes to say that, like, oh, if you're watching the film, like, he's one of these guys that will stand out to you. Like, he's not going to stand out to you in the same way that Alondas Williams will, though. Like, no. you do have to notice more nuanced things when it comes to the appreciation for LaRavia. Like, the defense. You have
to be watching specifically for LaRavia to appreciate his entire game.
Yeah, the defensive stuff is a little more nuanced, and it's not as apparent. And there are areas where he can improve defensively. But yeah, if you're buying into the jump shot with him, if you're buying into the high basketball IQ, maybe not the passing on the move, but similar to what we said with Vince Williams Jr., just be able to keep the ball moving. Mm-hmm. If you buy into a lot of these things and the versatility at that size with what he can project to be, which is an awesome role player. That's the type of guy that breaks into top 30s and goes in the first round. So I think you and I both have him in a good place. And I know that many of our no ceilings cohorts are also going to have him as a first round grade more likely than not. So I just think that's where we're trending. I think that's where we're going. And I do think he goes in the first round on draft night.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Like Nathan, I'm super looking forward to our next war room where we're talking about him because we brought him up in the early second round. I think he went a little bit later than I wanted him to because even at our last war room, I was really big. I wanted to prioritize him going to an early second round grade, but now that guys have got to see him more in person, that guys have made their rounds on watching him a little bit more. I think that his name is going to be brought up even before like I'm ready to be comfortable with, but I'm growing on him. He's another guy that I'm prioritizing watching again on my next round of film. I just want to make sure that my late first round is good because Nathan, like, I'm pretty happy with where I am in my lottery process right now. But before we wrap up the show, just a quick recap, Nathan. I'll go through 45 through 30. At 45, I had Justin Lewis. At 44, Caleb Houston. 43, Max Christie. 42, Keon Ellis. 41, Trevor Keels. At 40, I had Christian Koloko. 39, the return player, Leonard Miller. At 38, I had Alondis Williams. At 37, your friend, Christian Brown. At 36, I had Jan Montero. 35, Jalen Williams out of Santa Clara. At 34, I had my favorite player in the entire draft, Vince Williams Jr. I have my second favorite player at 33, Wendell Moore Jr. 32, Kendall Brown. 31, I had Nathan's favorite player and Bryce McGowan's, and then our friend Jake LaRavia at number 30.
I'd say that's quite the section of the big board that we talked about tonight, Steven. It only gets better from here. We keep breaking into more meat and potatoes. I already know that you and I are going to have a few fighting words as we keep moving through the last two episodes of this big board series with your big board. But this was another dynamite podcast, my friend. I certainly know that you put in as much work as I do in terms of evaluating these guys and slotting everybody on your board accordingly. And I appreciate the work and the viewpoints that you bring to this. And again, I'll just reiterate, that's why I wanted you to take over these episodes and make sure that your board was featured, because different perspectives need to be talked about on this podcast. If you're exclusively listening to this podcast for my thoughts and my opinions, I'm glad you're here, right? Like I want to create content. I want the views. I want the clicks, but that's not how we get better at doing this, myself included. That's why I think this their guys or his guys or her guys or whatever series that we've been doing on the Draft Deeper podcast, I think has been an incredible learning tool because it's bringing other guys to the forefront that we maybe wouldn't feature on a podcast. And then having these conversations around your board, Steven, not just my big board. Again, we're giving people opportunities to see different viewpoints and learn. And that's what I want this podcast to be. I don't just want it to be clickbait content about the top guys. I want this to be a very deep and comprehensive draft podcast where we're learning about a number of guys and we're getting better at the evaluation side of it, not just the who's who in the draft.
Yeah, you gotta look, man, like variety is the spice of life. If you're stuck in your echo chamber, you're never going to grow. Like Nathan, you put that perspective beautifully. Like if all you're listening to is your own thoughts, like how do you expect to get better at anything? How do you expect to grow? How are you ever going to learn that you could potentially be wrong? Like between you and I, Nathan, I would like to think that we're going to hit on a lot of our evaluations, but guess what?
We're going to get
the
a lot
NBA
of this
draft
wrong.
We're going to eat so much crow, but we like crow. We like the way it tastes.
Well, this draft in particular, though, we're going to get a lot wrong with this one. This is going to be a wild and wacky draft, and we're going to learn a lot of lessons looking back at this one, like 4 or 5 years from now, more so than the last like 2 or 3 drafts.
I'm looking forward to being like, and that's what the crazy thing, Nathan, like in my prior draft classes that I've evaluated, like I would be mad if I was wrong. Like I can't wait to find out like what I can learn from this draft class in particular, because if you can get these evaluations correct in this one, and you can learn the lessons that we're going to from this one, when we hit some of these bigger ones, where not saying that this draft class isn't important, I think you and I agree, like there's going to be a lot of NBA players coming out of this class.
Next class, I think, is where you're going, where there's a lot more top projected talent that's quote unquote easier to see their NBA role / potential. Yeah, hopefully you will take away a lot of good lessons from this draft class. But yeah,
we'll hit on sleepers in that class, like that other people would likely just be like, oh, well, this guy's like a shoe in at this spot. Like we can get a little bit more cute and a little bit more correct on, bigger, heavier draft classes. And I'm looking forward to it, man.
And do as Chuck said, watch the playoffs, learn lessons from the playoffs and from NBA, but you can't you can't get better at being a scout without watching NBA basketball. And honestly, I've done a very poor job of that myself this season. I need to do better at that going into next year. I've taken, I think, a little bit too much time watching and mulling over some of the tape on these guys rather than paying more attention to the program and actually figuring out what styles, what trends are really working. But I've been locked in to the playoffs this year, absolutely much more than I was during the regular season. So hopefully I can bring some new fresh ideas to the table as we keep going between now and the rest of the draft. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Draft Deeper podcast. Steven, thank you as always for hopping on and being the co-host that I deserve, my friend. So definitely let the people know where they can find you as you always do.
Well, and again, man, like I'm having a blast being the co-host here on Draft Deeper. You know, again, I'm sorry I missed the episode with Chuck. Y'all were phenomenal. Definitely can't wait to do some more work with him on Draft Deeper. And I'm looking forward to the shows that we have coming down the line, man. But for people who want to follow me, I'm the most active on Twitter. You can follow me at Stephen G Hoops. That's Stephen with a PH, the letter G, and then Hoops. You can find my written work on NoCeilingsNBA.com, where my most recent article just dropped, harping on Ron Harper Jr. as my featured prospect. I also have, early playoff entrants listed on there, like names that I think are going to matter for this upcoming draft class. And then also some of the transfer names that have been in circulation that you're not really hearing a lot about because we're focusing on the draft, but these are going to be future draft players. They're going to affect the players that you're going to be watching next year. So go read that article. I also had my prelude where I talked about why ageism is gross and how, good NBA teams are good NBA teams because they draft regardless of age. They might not draft them top 5 or whatever, but they certainly have staying power in redrafts. Like a Herb Jones might be, I don't know what, like the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th pick, like somewhere in that window. So, don't be afraid to draft a guy because he's, oh my goodness, 22 years old. But anyway, all my written work is on NoCeilingsNBA.com. You can hear me here on this show with this lovely co-host here, Nathan Grubel. Shout out to Kevin Black as the best producer in the game. And yeah, that's pretty much it, man.
And definitely thank you as always for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the Draft Deeper podcast, wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Make sure you're following me on Twitter as well, at Draft Deeper. Make sure you're following No Ceilings NBA on Twitter and subscribing to NoCeilingsNBA.com. By the time you will have listened to this podcast, like Steven said, he published his Weekend Warrior, did an incredible job with that. I will have a piece out on Michael Foster Jr. as well, one of my favorite second round, quote unquote, hidden gems that I'll be going into a little bit in my written work. And then coming up later this week on the podcast, Steven will be in the co-host chair, helping me host Bryce from Motor City Hoops. We're going to talk all things Detroit Pistons as I get ready to ramp up into some final rookie and sophomore coverage on the year. Some of that writing will be over on No Ceilings. And then Dakota Schmidt's also going to be coming on this podcast later in the week. Speaking of Draft Deeper, man, all the sickos, please come out for that show because I know some of the names we're going to talk about. And we are cutting deep, my friends. We're going to live up to the Draft Deeper mantra on that show. Dakota Schmidt, if you don't follow his work over at the Call Up, go subscribe to his Substack. He's doing incredible work on all things G League as he's done, as well as covering multiple different deep draft storylines. So definitely make sure you pay attention and watch out for that one. But until
and also real quick, Nathan, if by the time you're listening to this, I believe our guys Corey and Rucker will have the latest episode of On the Clock available on our YouTube channel at No Ceilings TV. So we had the grand unveiling of that last week. It was awesome. It's a good bite-sized piece of, if you like, pardon the interruption. It's a lot of that same style and feel where Corey and Rucker are debating with one another on different aspects of the draft and prospects. So believe the latest episode is going to be out by the time you're listening to this. So go over to our YouTube channel at No Ceilings TV and watch the latest episode of that.
Subscribe everywhere. No Ceilings NBA. Absolutely. But until then, thank you all for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.